The West promised Ukraine a path to victory, but the current reality is far from the dream that was sold. Ukraine now finds itself surrounded, besieged, and pleading for a ceasefire that Russia is determined to deny. There's no sugarcoating this situation. What's happening was inevitable. This is the result of a collision between great powers with smaller nations caught in the middle. Imagine a playground where the biggest kid keeps pushing the boundaries, gradually encroaching on the space of the second largest. The second kid warns over and over again, but the first kid ignores the warnings, confident that their strength and righteousness make them invulnerable. As time passes, more join in on the first kid's side, helping him push further. But eventually, the second kid fights back. Suddenly, everyone is shocked, labeling the retaliation as unprovoked and evil. But anyone with a basic understanding of playground dynamics could see this coming. This is the scenario unfolding before us. Now, Ukrainian forces are surrounded. President Zelensky, once resolute in his defense of his country, is now pleading for a ceasefire. But Russia remains steadfast in its refusal, not because of a particular cruelty on their part, but because the strategic logic behind their actions remains unchanged. In fact, this logic has only become stronger over time. To understand why, let's go back to 2014. I was among those who warned that the West was pushing Ukraine down a dangerous path. I made it clear that NATO expansion, European Union integration, and turning Ukraine into a Western stronghold right on Russia's doorstep would provoke a violent response. Not because I supported Russia's actions, but because I understood the nature of great power politics. Great powers do not tolerate hostile military alliances on their borders. This pattern is consistent throughout history. The United States acted decisively when Soviet missiles were stationed in Cuba. For over a century, Latin America has been treated similarly under the Monroe Doctrine. Great powers carve out spheres of influence and defend them with ruthless determination. Yet, Western policymakers ignored this historical reality. They believed that the liberal international order had transcended such primal logic. They thought that the spread of democracy, the growth of alliances, and the push for integration were inherently positive goals, and that Russia would simply have to accept these changes. They were catastrophically wrong, and now Ukraine is paying the price for it. What the media fails to mention is that this disaster was entirely foreseeable, not just in hindsight, but in real time. The decision to encourage Ukraine's NATO membership, to support the Maidan revolution, to arm and train the Ukrainian military, all of these actions sent a clear message to Moscow. We are turning Ukraine into a Western military outpost, and there is nothing you can do about it. But Russia could do something, and they did. They invaded. Some will tell you that this war is about Putin's imperial ambitions, his desire to recreate the Soviet Union, or his hatred of democracy. Let me make this clear. I am not here to defend Vladimir Putin. However, to understand Russia's actions, you must think like a Russian strategist, not a Western moralist. From Moscow's point of view, NATO's expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. This is not about democracy or values. It's about power and geography. Russia has been invaded twice from the West in the past century, first by Napoleon, then by Hitler. Both invasions cost Russia millions of lives. The idea that Russia would simply sit by while a hostile military alliance sets up on its border is pure fantasy. Yet the West continued pushing forward, disregarding this basic principle, and here we are today. Ukraine believed the West. They believed that aligning themselves with the West would guarantee the security they sought. They were told that democracy and sovereignty would protect them from Russian aggression. They thought they could have it all, Western integration and security. But the harsh truth is that great powers don't fight wars for ideals. They fight for strategic interests. And Ukraine is not a vital interest for either the United States or Europe. We'll arm Ukraine, impose sanctions on Russia, and deliver speeches about the importance of the international order. But we will not fight and die for Ukraine. This brutal lesson is unfolding for the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's forces are now encircled, its cities are under siege, its infrastructure lies in ruins. And President Zelensky, who once vowed to fight to the last, is now desperately pleading for a ceasefire. Yet Russia refuses to budge. Why? Because Russia understands something that the West still refuses to accept. Wars end when the strategic objectives of the winning side are achieved, and Russia's objectives haven't changed. Russia wants Ukraine neutral, NATO expansion reversed, and assurances that Ukraine will never become a Western military outpost. With Ukrainian forces collapsing and Western support waning, Russia has no reason to stop. The logic of power is simple. If harsh, Russia will not grant a ceasefire out of mercy or international pressure. They will keep pushing until their objectives are met or until the costs become unbearable. But from where I stand, those costs are not yet unbearable for Russia. Despite facing sanctions, Russia has redirected its trade to China, India, and the global South. Their economy has adapted. It hasn't collapsed. Meanwhile, Europe is grappling with an energy crisis. Inflation is eroding public support for the war, and the United States is increasingly distracted by China and domestic issues. Time is on Russia's side. The longer the war continues, the weaker Ukraine becomes, and the stronger Russia's bargaining position grows. You may find this analysis cold, perhaps even indifferent to the suffering of the Ukrainian people. But let me be clear, I am not callous or unconcerned about the human cost of this conflict. I wish this war had never happened. I wish that Ukraine could have avoided this tragedy altogether. But wishing doesn't change reality. The reality is that Ukraine is in a catastrophic situation because Western policymakers made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believed they could expand NATO without consequences. They thought Russia would simply accept it. They were wrong. And now the people of Ukraine are paying the price for that mistake. This is not just a lesson for Ukraine, but for the international system at large. The global order we live in is anarchic. There is no higher authority enforcing rules or protecting the weak. In this environment, great powers do what they must to ensure their own security. Smaller states often get caught in the crossfire. This is the harsh reality of international politics. It has been this way for centuries and will likely remain so for centuries to come. The United States likes to think that we've transcended this kind of logic, that we've evolved beyond it. We speak about universal values, human rights, democracy, and I agree these things are important. But when it comes to hard decisions, states act according to their strategic interests, not their values. The US has done it, Russia is doing it, and China will do it when the time comes. This is not cynicism, it's realism. If you don't understand this, you will make disastrous policy decisions, and that's exactly what we did in Ukraine. So what happens now? My prediction, remember I've been right about this conflict from the start, is that Russia will continue its offensive until Ukraine capitulates or until Western governments pressure Kyiv into accepting terms, and those terms will not be kind. Ukraine will lose territory, it will be forced into neutrality, NATO expansion will be dead in the east, all the bloodshed, all the destruction, all the suffering will have been for nothing. Ukraine will end up in a worse position than if the West had simply acknowledged Russia's security concerns back in 2014 and negotiated a neutral status for Ukraine. I predicted this outcome years ago. I was ignored. I was labeled an apologist for aggression, but I wasn't defending anything. I was predicting the future. And predictions based on an understanding of great power politics tend to come true, whether we like it or not. The encirclement of Ukrainian forces is not just a military development, it's a political inflection point. This is the moment when the narrative we've been hearing for years, the narrative of Ukraine's inevitable victory, Russia's impending collapse, the idea that one more shipment of weapons would change everything, finally crashes into reality. For 2 years, we've been told that Ukraine was winning, that Russia was on the verge of collapse, that a little more help from the West would turn the tide. None of that was true. Now, as Ukrainian soldiers are surrounded and President Zelensky pleads for terms that Russia has no intention of granting, we must face the truth. This war was a mistake, not Russia's invasion. That was inevitable, given our policies. The real mistake was the West's decision to lead Ukraine down this path in the first place. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. Diplomacy could have worked, neutrality could have worked, but we chose expansion over caution, ideology over strategy. And now Ukraine is paying the price. Russia's saying no to a ceasefire because they're winning. And they're winning because the balance of power, once ignored, now favors them completely. It's crucial to recognize that this conflict is a direct result of the decisions made by Western policymakers over the past decade. The West may want to portray this as a moral fight, good versus evil, democracy versus autocracy, but in the cold light of geopolitics, this conflict is about raw strategic calculation. The West misunderstood Russia's position, and now the people of Ukraine are caught in the middle, paying the price for that miscalculation. The war is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It's about the limits of Western power and the consequences of underestimating the basic principles of great power politics. As the situation unfolds, we must ask ourselves, what could have been done differently? What would have happened if the West had acted with more foresight, with more understanding of the realities at play? It's easy to say in hindsight that things could have been handled differently. But the truth is, those who warned of this outcome were dismissed, labeled as pessimists, or worse. Now, as Ukrainian forces fight desperately and encirclement and cities crumble, the truth becomes undeniable. The logic of power, the calculation of strategic interests has won out. Ukraine, once a hopeful partner in the West's grand vision of expansion, is now a tragic symbol of how geopolitical aspirations can end in disaster. In those early days of NATO's outreach, Ukraine was promised security, the benefits of Western integration, and the protection of its sovereignty. But no one in the West bothered to understand what these promises would mean for Russia. They assumed that Russia, having emerged from the Soviet Union's collapse, would simply accept the West's growing influence on its borders. This was a catastrophic misreading of history. Russia's actions in Ukraine are not about imperialism in the traditional sense. They are about survival. Russia views NATO expansion as a direct threat to its security, a challenge to its strategic interests, and an existential risk. This is not a new argument. Russia has been warning the West for years. They have been clear in their objections to NATO's eastward expansion. The West, however, refused to listen. Instead of seeking compromise, instead of acknowledging the security concerns that Russia had expressed, the West pushed forward, convinced that the world had changed and that power politics no longer mattered. But power politics are as relevant today as they ever were. And the tragic reality of Ukraine's situation is the result of the West's failure to understand this. Ukraine's plea for a ceasefire, its desperate calls for peace, are not signs of weakness, but of profound recognition of the grim reality that has unfolded. President Zelensky, once firm in his resolve, now faces the reality that his country is surrounded, its military resources dwindling, and its cities under siege. The West's promises of unwavering support have been tested, and those promises are now starting to show cracks. The reality is that Western powers, despite their sanctions and speeches about international order, are not willing to risk everything to secure Ukraine's future. The West will arm Ukraine, provide aid, and impose sanctions on Russia, but they will not send troops to fight and die for Ukraine. The situation is dire. Russia has already made its strategic calculations and is moving steadily toward its goal. NATO's eastward expansion will be reversed. Ukraine will be forced into a position of neutrality. The goals Russia set out to achieve in this conflict will be realized. The war may continue, but the outcome is already clear. The only question remaining is how much more suffering will Ukraine endure before it reaches the inevitable conclusion. The reality of power politics is harsh, but it is also simple. The West's mistake was believing that ideology, democracy, and the spread of alliances would outweigh the strategic interests of Russia. They underestimated how deeply Russia feels about its security. They overlooked the history of invasions that shaped Russia's perception of the world, and now Ukraine is paying the price. This is not just about territorial loss for Ukraine. It's about the complete reordering of the geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe. What once seemed like a far-off, abstract possibility is now coming to fruition in real time. Ukraine's suffering is heartbreaking, and no one should downplay the pain and destruction that is unfolding. But we must be clear-eyed about how we arrived at this point. The West's policies in Ukraine, their attempts to expand NATO, and their failure to engage in honest dialogue with Russia all led to this catastrophic outcome. The question now is not whether Ukraine can win, it's whether the West will recognize that this war was a product of their own choices and that the time for negotiation and diplomacy is long past. Looking forward, the options are limited and the choices before the international community are stark. The war has reached a point where the West's options for intervention are dwindling. The sanctions, while damaging, have not crippled Russia's economy to the point of forcing them to negotiate. Russia's economy has adapted, shifted its trade to new partners like China, India, and countries in the global south, which has mitigated the effects of Western pressure. The energy crisis in Europe, the rising inflation, and the increasing distraction of the U.S. with domestic and international issues mean that time is not on Ukraine's side, it's on Russia's. As this war drags on, Ukraine becomes weaker and Russia's bargaining position strengthens. This isn't a theory or a prediction anymore, it's the current reality. The longer the war continues, the more entrenched Russia's position becomes and the more precarious Ukraine's situation becomes. While the West continues to send weapons and economic aid, this support is not enough to shift the balance of power. It's not enough to turn the tide of a war where the strategic objectives are clear and Russia's resolve is unbroken. Ukraine, despite its valiant efforts, is running out of options. The support from the West, though significant, is not enough to match the strategic interests at play, and the situation continues to deteriorate. For Ukraine's leaders, there's an undeniable truth. Their country is caught in a geopolitical struggle where it's no longer in control of its fate. Ukraine's future now depends on the choices made by the great powers, and those powers have long made their positions clear. The West, despite its rhetoric about democracy and sovereignty, will not fight and die for Ukraine. It has its own strategic interests, its own priorities, and Ukraine, unfortunately, is not one of them. What the West failed to recognize, and what Ukraine now understands all too well, is the great powers don't make decisions based on ideals alone. They make decisions based on strategic needs. Ukraine's integration into NATO, the push for closer ties with the European Union, and the Western support for its military, all of these moves were seen by Russia as direct threats to its security. And when you are dealing with a great power like Russia, security concerns are not just about politics, they are about survival. The West may have believed it was championing the cause of democracy and sovereignty, but to Russia, these moves were perceived as existential threats, and Russia responded as great powers do by taking action. Now, Ukraine must face the consequences of the West's failure to understand this. Ukraine is paying the price for policies that overestimated the ability of liberal ideals to reshape the world without regard for the harsh realities of power politics. The tragic irony is that all the weapons, all the support from the West may not be enough to prevent Ukraine from being forced into a corner diplomatically and militarily. Russia's demands have not changed. It wants Ukraine neutral, it wants NATO's expansion reversed, and it wants to ensure that Ukraine will never again become a Western military outpost. With Ukraine's forces collapsing and the West's support faltering, Russia has no incentive to halt its advance. As we look at the outcome of this war, we are faced with a difficult truth. The longer this conflict continues, the more devastating it will be for Ukraine, and the less likely it becomes that Ukraine will be able to regain its territorial integrity. The ceasefire that President Zelensky is pleading for will not be granted because Russia has already achieved its strategic goals. The West may try to impose sanctions, deliver speeches, and provide aid, but they are not willing to fight for Ukraine in the way that would make a difference. And so the conflict grinds on with no clear resolution in sight. Ukraine is not simply fighting for its territory, it is fighting for its very survival as a sovereign nation. But in the end, survival is not determined solely by military strength. It is determined by the strategic calculations of the great powers. And right now, those powers are not fighting for Ukraine's survival. They are fighting for their own strategic interests. And as long as that remains the case, Ukraine's future looks increasingly uncertain. Looking ahead, the future of Ukraine seems increasingly grim. The conflict is no longer just about territorial disputes or military victories. It's about the harsh realities of great power, politics, and the unrelenting struggle for survival. Ukraine's position in this conflict has become more precarious with each passing day, as its military forces are surrounded, its infrastructure crumbling, and its leaders calling for peace that seems increasingly out of reach. The world watches as Ukraine's suffering unfolds, but the cold truth is that the decisions made by Western powers years ago have led to this moment. The West, for all its lofty ideals about democracy, sovereignty, and human rights, is faced with a sobering reality. Its power to change the course of this conflict is limited. Russia is not a nation that can be easily swayed by sanctions, speeches, or economic pressure. Russia's strategic goals are clear, and they are not negotiable. Ukraine will be forced to concede, whether through direct negotiations or military collapse. The West will continue to offer support, but it is becoming increasingly clear that this support will not be enough to turn the tide. The harsh truth is that Ukraine is a victim of a geopolitical game that it had no part in starting, and now it finds itself paying the ultimate price. The decision to expand NATO, to push for Ukraine's closer integration into the European Union, and to arm the Ukrainian military was made with little regard for the inevitable consequences. These actions were seen by Russia as existential threats, and they responded in kind. Now, Ukraine is caught in the middle of a conflict that was set in motion by the West's miscalculations. The war may continue, but the outcome is already determined. Russia's demands will be met, Ukraine will be forced into neutrality, NATO's expansion will be halted, and the strategic landscape in Eastern Europe will be permanently altered. The tragedy of Ukraine's situation is that it didn't have to be this way. A diplomatic solution could have been reached. Neutrality could have been a viable option for Ukraine, and the war might have been avoided. But the West's ideological commitments and the belief that expansion was always a positive force led to this disastrous outcome. Now, as Russia continues its march toward victory, the cost of these mistakes is becoming painfully clear. Ukraine's suffering is not in vain, however. It serves as a powerful reminder of the brutal reality of international politics. Smaller nations, despite their desires for sovereignty and security, are often at the mercy of the great powers. In this case, the great powers made their decisions, and Ukraine was left to bear the consequences. This war, this tragedy, is a direct result of the West's refusal to acknowledge the fundamental rules of great power politics. The balance of power, once ignored, has now reasserted itself with devastating consequences. As we reflect on the path that led to this moment, we must understand that the world we live in is not governed by ideals alone. It is governed by power, by the strategic interests of great nations, and by the harsh realities of geopolitics. The United States, Russia, China, and other global powers act based on their own interests, and those interests will always come before abstract notions of democracy or human rights. This is the world we live in, and this is the lesson that Ukraine is learning the hard way. In the end, what we are witnessing is not just the tragedy of one nation, but the unfolding of a broader lesson about the limits of power, the consequences of miscalculation, and the brutal realities of international relations. The West may have hoped that Ukraine could hold out, that it could force Russia into a compromise, but the reality is that Russia's power has proven too great, and Ukraine's situation has become increasingly desperate. The question now is not whether Ukraine will survive this conflict, but what the lasting impact will be on the international order. Will the world learn from this mistake? Will the West understand that great powers do not operate on the basis of ideals alone? Or will we continue to make the same miscalculations, sending smaller nations into the fires of conflict for the sake of strategic ambitions that ultimately have little to do with their survival?